From gun confiscation to the economy, what is the crisis happening in Venezuela? Tell us about the path of destruction we're following here in our own country. Joining me now is David Knight. And David, now you want to bring up some very scary similarities with what's actually happening in Venezuela right now. And we're seeing the writing on the wall here in the U.S.
Of course, this is something, Leanne, we've been talking about. It's been developing for quite some time. This goes back to the predecessor of the current dictator in Venezuela, Maduro. It goes back to Hugo Chavez. It goes back to their command and control of the economy and taking that down. But there's other aspects that we haven't really talked about in depth. One of those is gun confiscation, how that preceded what we're seeing right now. And of course, this last weekend, there was a massive military drill in Venezuela. 500,000 people in Venezuela in the military did this massive display of power. Who was that directed at? Now, of course, the president of Venezuela said that was directed at the United States that wants to invade his country. And this is a familiar meme that we've seen time and again. Yes, the CIA has overthrown governments. We've talked about that many times here at InfoWars. But every time these socialist economies fail, it isn't because of direct American intervention. It's not because of our foreign intervention. It's because of their socialist government's intervention in their economy. That's really what's going on here in Venezuela. Now let's talk about what happened this last weekend. They had, and of course, Coca-Cola has stopped production there. That is a sign, Leanne, that the end of the world is happening when you can't get your Coke produced, okay? But what they did in Venezuela was really to set up 2 days of war games that were designed as a show of strength to the population. And this is something that a fellow who grew up and was born in Venezuela, now is teaching in London, says that the stakes have become very high for government officials because they realize that as upset as the people in Venezuela are, it's going to be a matter of life and death for them, as well as the people in Venezuela are seeing that this is a matter of life and death for the ordinary people in Venezuela because they can't get food, they can't get medicine, they're dying in the hospital. So we'll briefly review that for you. But first of all, what happened this weekend? Well, we had more than 500,000 servicemen and women, reservists, militia deployed alongside anti-riot displays and Russian-made jets on the streets in a hastily convened show of strength. Now, why is this happening? Well, because there's a few possible ways that this could play out. There could be a recall election, and they raised 1.8 million signatures to start a recall election because they're very unhappy with the government there. And after they did a 60-day moratorium on that, and his response was to come down hard against the people who were trying to do that. He declared a 60-day state of emergency once they delivered 1.8 million petitions. How many do they need? Well, in a country of only 30 million people, they need 4 million petitions to have a democratic process, to have a recall election. And of course, they're playing all kinds of games. At first, they refused to even deliver the ballots to the people who were trying to get these petitions signed. Then they threatened, as they started going door to door to get the petition signed, they threatened anyone who was employed by the Venezuelan government, and that's most of the people who have jobs because it's a socialist country. They threatened them that they would lose their jobs if they signed this petition. So they're really doubling down. They're really playing hardball, and that wasn't enough. Now he brings up the threat of a military dictatorship. But the question is, can he control the military, or will there be a coup d'etat? He doesn't have the kind of military connections or the charisma that Hugo Chavez did, who was part of a military dictatorship. So the question is, will they be able to do that, or is it going to descend into total anarchy and rioting on the streets? And of course, we've already seen how you've got empty shelves, you've got doctors who are testifying about what happens. Listen to this report from the BBC. They said, they showed me wards that were crammed full of patients without basic medical equipment. I spoke to patient after patient whose operations could only proceed after they themselves had bought the appropriate medical supplies like splints, dressings, antibiotics. I spoke to parents of a baby severely ill with acute respiratory complications. They had to dig deep into their own pockets for an ill-fitting mask and a respirator to keep them alive. And then they talked to a doctor who says, our patients are dying in the hospitals. I've had to pay for their own supplies myself, and like 40% of the other doctors here, I'm reluctantly about to leave the country. But look at what happened 4 years ago as this began. Even before Hugo Chavez died and left office, they began to confiscate weapons. And we were told at the time, we've seen clips. Let's play this short clip from the NRA.
I emigrated from Venezuela, one of the most dangerous countries in the world today. A few years ago, the government came for our guns. We were told we would be safer without them. Of course, the politicians, the rich and famous, their bodyguards and criminals, they still have their guns. They would do anything for the Second Amendment freedom that we enjoy as Americans.
Okay, now that's a clip from the NRA, somebody who lived in Venezuela. And it's important to understand that the policies of gun confiscation lead to us not being able to protect ourselves against crime. But you need to understand, as we pointed out at InfoWars just last November, that even the police can't protect themselves from crime. This story, murdered for their guns, Venezuela's police are now the victims of crime. Officers are being killed for their weapons, for their motorbikes, even for their mobile phones. They said 252 security officers have been killed last year from January to October, mainly so they could get their guns. See, this is something that police officers in the United States understand, that they are safer when the citizenry has guns. Because if it's outlawed, as they did in Venezuela, then they are going to be hunted and killed for their guns, just like they are in Venezuela. And this went back back to 2012, but by 2014, they had actually set up disarmament centers. Now, we joke about gun-free zones being victim disarmament centers. No, these were literal disarmament centers. And this bankrupt country spent $47 million to set up these disarmament centers. And this is what it's truly about, folks. This is not even about crime. It's not about people being able to protect themselves against drug cartels and common criminals on the street. It's about a tool of social control. As they were rolling this out, listen to these quotes from Maduro at the time. He said, "Let us chase after the dream, after the utopia of Venezuela and peace. Disarmament must come from the conscience of the youth." Doesn't that sound like something that Rahm Emanuel has said? Mm-hmm. All right, now let's talk about why the left won't apologize for this catastrophe. Because we've seen Bernie Sanders talk about how wonderful Nicaragua was. We've seen the clips played from 30 years ago. And when he was called on that, he comes out and says, well, I was talking about it in the context of health care and a general spirit of reform and so forth and so on. He was criticized by, of all people, by Hillary Clinton. She said, you know, if the values that you oppress people, you disappear people, you imprison people, you kill people for expressing their opinions, for expressing freedom of speech, that's not the kind of revolution of values that I ever want to see anywhere. Hillary Clinton said that, except that her economic advisor, Joseph Stiglitz, has promoted, along with all the rest of these leftist economists, the same types of conditions and controls that have brought about the economic collapse of Venezuela in the first place. During a 2007 visit, Joseph Stiglitz, who got the 2001 Nobel Prize in economics, praised what he called the positive policies of the Chavez administration. I'm reading from the Mises Institute. They really break down the economics aspect of this. They say Stiglitz has been described as an influential advisor to Hillary Clinton. He appears determined to bring similar policies here. He called for rewriting the rules of the American economy. He called for a crusade against income inequality. His policy recommendations included higher taxes, smarter regulation, having the Federal Reserve focus more on unemployment than keeping inflation low. In other words, a call for an even more federal activist Fed than we have seen since 2008. Now, this is precisely what is going to destroy this country. It's not going to be the interference of a foreign country, although we see in Venezuela, we see the Russians siding with the Venezuelan people and the Pope, because it's about income equality. Yeah, they've got equality. They've got absolutely nothing. And if we go back and we look at what's happening across the rest of Central and Southern America, we see that basically Venezuela is collapsing. A lot of people say, well, it's a collapse in oil. No, you've got a collapse in these other economies as well. In Bolivia, in Brazil, places that are based on socialism are collapsing. It isn't simply the oil. You know, there's nothing that is exported, as far as I know, out of Venezuela other than oil and voting machines, electronic voting machines. They created the Smartmatic voting machines in Venezuela, cronies of Hugo Chavez, and they're exporting that kind of fraud to Brazil, to Mexico, to other Central and South American countries, and they're exporting that kind of fraud to the United States. Even the Republicans brought it in for the Utah primary. This is where it's all headed. Economic collapse from a centralized interventionist economy, gun confiscation so they can control the population, and it all falls back to their economic policies. That's why we have to be concerned about the massive embrace of socialism by the population here.
Right, and if it is working, then they're going to flood the country with illegal immigrants to tear it down as well. Thank you so much, David. We'll have to keep our eye on what's going on in Venezuela. Thank you all for tuning into the show tonight. We'll see you here again tomorrow, 7 p.m. Central.
Get Brain Force at 25% off for a limited time at InfoWarsLife.com.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've been on this the last few months. You probably noticed I've been more crazed, more focused, less brain fog, more energy, more special reports, and it's because of Brain Force.
One of the worst things with most energy products is it's not sustainable, right? You're gonna crash afterwards. And the cool thing about this is it's not just a bunch of energy compounds that are gonna fire your brain up to a higher RPM or whatever, which it does do. This is sustainable. This isn't going to spike and you're gonna collapse and you're gonna feel really bad afterwards. This has a bunch of different antioxidants and compounds and polyphenols.
Everybody's on these drugs to knock their brain out because the brain's so fried.
We're looking at the television screen for research purposes, whatever we're even doing, trying to learn something, or staring at the computer all day, working, doing good. You're still damaging your brain.
You will find Brain Force and other game-changing products at InfoWarsLife.com or call 888-253-3139.
Get Brain Force at 25% off for a limited time at InfoWarsLife.com. And we thank you for your support.